Clover is a Christian Black African woman with an unshakable faith, a woman whose heart beats in rhythm with God's divine plan, even when the path before her is uncertain. She did not choose China. God chose it for her. Deep in her soul, she believes that her steps have been ordered, that the Lord has sent her to this foreign land for a purpose far greater than her understanding. Leaving South Africa, the only home she had ever known, was not an easy decision. The familiar voices of loved ones, the rich, vibrant culture of her people, the warmth of the African sun, all of it now felt like a distant memory as she stepped into a land where she was a stranger in every sense of the word. The unfamiliarity was overwhelming. The language felt like an intricate puzzle she could barely piece together, the customs and traditions vastly different from what she was used to. And yet, she did not waver. She held on to Jeremiah 29:11. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future." There were nights when loneliness wrapped itself around her like an unrelenting shadow. Nights when she longed to hear her mother's voice, to sit at her grandmother's feet and listen to the wisdom of generations past. There were moments when the city's towering skyscrapers and bustling streets felt like walls closing in, threatening to suffocate the purpose she clung to. But even in the silence, even in the stillness, God spoke, "My daughter, I am with you." The reassurance of Isaiah 55, 8-9 echoed in her heart. "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." She did not need to understand everything. She only needed to trust. And so, she embraced her new life in China with unwavering faith. Every challenge was an opportunity to lean into God's wisdom. Every difficulty in learning the language was a moment to humble herself before Him. Every door that refused to open was a test of patience, a call to wait upon the Lord. Clover was not just in China by accident. She was there by divine assignment. Even when she did not see the full picture, she knew she was walking the path God had set for her. And in that knowledge, she found peace, she found strength, and above all, she found purpose. Marco Lee was forged in suffering, hardened by pain, and sharpened by betrayal. He is a ruthless, super-rich Chinese CEO, a man whose very name commands fear and respect in the business world. Mercy is weakness, and weakness is death. That is the law by which he lives. He believes in power, in control, in the sharp edge of ambition. But he does not believe in God. To him, faith is an illusion, a crutch for the desperate. He had been desperate once, and God had not come. His disbelief is not born out of arrogance, but from a wound so deep, so raw, that even the passing of time has failed to heal it. As a child, he prayed. With tears streaming down his face, he begged for rescue, for kindness, for a miracle, but none came. Hunger gnawed at his stomach. The cold night air cut through his skin, and the harsh world turned its back on him. Marco was not born into wealth. He was born into nothing. An orphan, abandoned by fate, left at the mercy of a world that had none. His only solace was his frail, aging grandmother, the one person who had ever loved him, the only warmth in an otherwise brutal life. But that warmth was stolen from him too. A cruel and greedy relative, a man with no conscience and a hunger for wealth, chased them out of their home, leaving them to survive on the streets. They wandered, they starved, they suffered. His grandmother, frail as she was, tried to shield him, to comfort him, to remind him that they still had each other. But love does not feed an empty stomach. Love does not stop the cold. And so, one fateful night, as she lay beside him on the hard, unforgiving pavement, she breathed her last. He held her fragile hand, his small fingers trembling against her lifeless skin. He prayed. He begged. He called out to the God his grandmother had spoken of, to the heaven she had believed in. But silence was his only answer. That was the moment Marco Lee died, and the ruthless man he would become was born. Pain had taught him a lesson. The world does not care. There is no God, no salvation, no justice. The only way to survive was to take control, to build walls so high that no one could ever hurt him again. He vowed to himself that he would never be weak, never be helpless, never beg again. By the time he was a teenager, his heart had turned to stone. He clawed his way out of the gutter, using his mind like a weapon, his ambition like a blade. Every deal he made, every company he crushed, every empire he conquered, each was another step toward invincibility. He became ruthless, powerful, and untouchable. His wealth became his armor, his influence his sword. He was feared. He was respected. He had no weakness. Until he met Clover. Clover with her faith. Clover with her unwavering belief in a God Marco had long abandoned. She was the one thing he had never prepared for, a force that did not bend to his power, a woman who looked him in the eye and did not flinch. For the first time in his life, Marco felt something other than rage, other than hunger for control. He felt something dangerous, something unfamiliar, something he could not name. And that terrified him. Because if there was one thing Marco Lee knew, it was this: every weakness can be exploited. And Clover, she was becoming his greatest one. The rain poured heavily over the city, drumming against the glass of Marco Lee's sleek black luxury car as he sat in silence, staring out at the bustling streets of Shanghai. The city was alive, as always, but he wasn't watching the hurried businessmen or the gleaming lights reflected on the slick pavement. His gaze was locked on something, or rather, someone, completely unexpected. A woman. A black woman. She stood in the middle of the street, completely drenched, yet utterly unbothered. She wasn't running for shelter like everyone else. No umbrella, no frantic dash to escape the downpour. Instead, she was laughing, dancing. With arms outstretched, face tilted up toward the sky, she twirled with unrestrained joy, her soaked curls glistening under the dim light of the setting sun. Around her, a group of children splashed and giggled, mimicking her playful movements, their laughter ringing out like a melody in the storm. The world around them rushed by in a blur of routine and urgency, but they existed outside of it, wild, free, untouched by the coldness of reality. Marco Lee had never seen anything like it. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel, his jaw clenched. What was she doing? Why? The concept was foreign to him, unnecessary. People did not dance in the rain. People did not waste time indulging in something so meaningless. And yet, he couldn't look away. There was something about the way she moved. Effortless, uninhibited, fearless. She wasn't just standing in the rain. She was embracing it. Like it was a gift. Like it was something holy. Holy! The word soured in his mind. He didn't believe in such things. There was no God, no divine blessings, no mercy. There was only survival. And survival meant control, power, ruthlessness. But there she was, a contradiction to everything he had ever known. She belonged to an entirely different world than his. And yet, something in him stirred. Something dangerous. Something he had long buried beneath the weight of his empire. He should have looked away, should have driven off, erased this moment from his mind like he did with anything that did not serve him. But he didn't. Instead, Marco sat there, rain streaming down his windshield, watching a woman who didn't belong in his world, yet captivated him like nothing ever had. Clover. He didn't know her name yet, but he already knew one thing. This moment would haunt him. Clover had not come to China to fight battles in boardrooms or to challenge the empire of a man she had never met. She had come to serve, to help, to be a light in a foreign land where God had called her. Her work with a local humanitarian project was supposed to be about hope, healing, and faith, not about powerful businessmen who saw compassion as a threat. She had been working tirelessly with a nonprofit organization focused on providing shelter and resources to displaced families, abandoned children, and elderly citizens with nowhere to go. The project was small but impactful, growing in influence as it reclaimed forgotten spaces in the city, turning abandoned buildings into safe havens. Clover had poured her heart into it, believing she was part of something truly meaningful. What she didn't know was that one of those very buildings stood in the way of a multi-million-dollar real estate deal, a deal that belonged to Marco Lee, a deal that was not meant to be disrupted. Clover's first warning came through whispers. Then it came through displaced workers, shuttered windows, and increasing pressure from city officials. Something was happening. Something powerful. Something that could crush everything she had worked for. Then came the official summons, a meeting, a confrontation. She didn't know who she was about to meet, only that it was someone with the power to destroy everything with a single command. And so, she walked into the pristine, glass-walled headquarters of Lee Enterprises, where power reigned like a merciless king. She was escorted through sleek hallways, past assistants who moved like shadows, until she was brought into a massive office, cold and clinical, a perfect reflection of the man standing behind the desk. Marco Lee. The moment their eyes met, a current passed between them, electric yet chilling. The man before her was not just rich, he was power personified, with a tailored black suit that fit him like armor, sharp, angular features carved from stone, and an expression so unreadable it made her feel like she was standing before a predator. Marco was everything she had heard about, and worse. But Clover was not afraid. "You're in my way," he said simply, his voice calm but cutting. She lifted her chin, refusing to let him intimidate her. "Number? I'm helping people who need it." He leaned against his desk, eyes narrowing. "And I'm building something that will employ thousands. Do you honestly think your little charity is more important than progress?" Clover held his gaze, her spine straight, her voice unwavering. "I think human lives are more important than profit." Marco chuckled, slow and taunting, but there was no amusement in his eyes, spoken like someone who has never had to fight for survival. "I have fought for survival, just in a different way," she countered. "I trust in a God who provides." His expression hardened, a flicker of something dark and wounded flashing behind his eyes. He stepped forward, his presence towering, overwhelming. "There is no God," Marco said, his voice like steel. "There is only power, and you're about to learn how it works." Clover refused to flinch. Instead, she met him head-on, her faith a shield he could not break. "You don't scare me, Mr. Lee." For the first time in a long time, someone defied him, and for reasons he didn't understand, that infuriated him as much as it intrigued him. Marco Lee was not a man accustomed to opposition. When he wanted something, he took it. When something got in his way, he crushed it. And yet, Clover did not move. What should have been a simple elimination of an inconvenience turned into a battle of unyielding faith against unrelenting power. He sent legal teams after her. Documents, threats, attempts to push her out. She prayed. She stayed. He shut down funding sources, made calls, pulled strings, made sure donations stopped flowing. She trusted. She found another way. He sent people to scare her. A whispered warning here, a veiled threat there. She held her ground. She refused to fear. every move he made, she countered with unwavering faith. And for the first time in his life, Marco Lee realized that money and power could not break everyone, but he was not a man who gave up easily. If she wanted a war, she had just declared one. What Marco didn't realize, however, was that the more he fought against her, the more he was drawn to her. Clover had always believed in the power of faith, in God's ability to guide her steps and shield her heart from temptation. She had seen it time and time again, how faith transformed lives, how prayer mended wounds, how love, when rooted in righteousness, could conquer even the deepest darkness. But what happens when the darkness calls to you? She had tried to deny it, to push it away, to rebuke the growing pull toward Marco Lee. He was everything she shouldn't want. Ruthless, powerful, a man whose hands had been stained by the merciless world he ruled. He was a force of destruction, and yet, something about him stirred a fire inside her. Something she could not explain. Why God? Why him? She had always known 2 Corinthians 6:14. Do not be yoked together with unbelievers. For what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? Or what fellowship can light have with darkness? And yet, despite knowing this verse, despite hearing it echo in her mind every time Marco's eyes lingered on her too long, despite the battle raging inside her, she could not stop thinking about him. One night, overwhelmed with emotion, she broke down. Sitting in the dim glow of her small apartment, tears stinging her eyes, she picked up her phone and called the one person she trusted with her deepest struggles, her mentor, Sister Yvonne. I can't do this, Clover whispered as soon as the call connected, her voice raw with pain. I can't stop thinking about him, and I hate myself for it. How can I love a man who spills blood without remorse? How can I, knowing everything he is? Silence stretched between them for a moment before Sister Yvonne spoke, her voice steady and filled with wisdom. Clover, love and faith are not about perfection, but about redemption. Maybe you are the guiding light Marco needs for his soul to be saved. Clover's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to reject that thought, to tell herself that Marco Lee was beyond saving, that he was too far gone. But hadn't she spent her whole life believing that God's mercy knew no limits? That even the most broken soul could find salvation? But why her? Why did she have to be the one to stand in the storm with a man like Marco? That night, as she fell to her knees in prayer, her anguish poured out in desperate words. God, if you are trying to save him, choose someone else for the job. She clenched her hands together, eyes shut tightly, waiting, pleading for an answer, a sign, a release from the feelings that refused to leave her heart. But he was silent, and the more she prayed that prayer, the deeper her feelings for Marco grew. Marco had built his life upon walls of steel, reinforced by power and control. Emotions were weaknesses, distractions meant to be eradicated. And yet, Clover had unraveled something inside him. She was supposed to be just another problem to eliminate, another name in a long list of those who had dared stand against him. But Clover was different. She didn't break. She didn't cower. She looked him in the eye, challenged him, and didn't waver. And that should have made him want to destroy her. Instead, he wanted to understand her. But with every moment he spent thinking about her, memories from his past surfaced, ones he had spent years burying beneath his empire. His grandmother's hands, frail but warm, cupping his face as she told him stories about God. The nights they spent on the streets, when she still held on to faith even when they had nothing. The prayers he whispered as a boy, ones that were never answered. And now, Clover was here. A woman who carried the same unshakable faith. A woman whose presence shattered his carefully built world. He found himself watching her more than he should. listening to her words longer than he intended. There was a fire in her spirit that unnerved him, intrigued him, and enraged him all at once. He should walk away, should crush this weakness before it became something more. But he didn't. And it was in his weakest moment that he made a mistake. It happened in the quiet. After another confrontation, another battle of wills, Clover turned to leave, but Marco, for the first time in his life, acted on impulse. He caught her wrist, spinning her around. She gasped, startled by the sudden proximity. The world outside was muted, lost in the tension between them. She was so close, too close. He could see the way her chest rose and fell with each breath, the way her lips parted slightly in surprise. She should have pulled away. She should have run, but she didn't. And he, a man who had never hesitated to take what he wanted, found himself uncertain. His hand lifted, brushing a stray curl from her face, his fingers lingering against her skin. It was soft, warm, a contrast to the cold world he had known. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned in. Then, she placed a firm hand on his chest, stopping him. Marco stilled. The rejection hit him harder than it should have. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of something unshakable. "I will not love a man who does not love Jesus Christ." The words cut through him, sharper than any blade, more brutal than any business deal gone wrong. He had been rejected before, by society, by family, by the very God she believed in, but never like this. He took a step back, his expression unreadable, but inside, something was unraveling. Clover turned and walked away, her presence leaving a hollow space in the room. And for the first time in a very long time, Marco Lee felt something he did not know how to fight, something that refused to let him go. For a man like Marco Lee, weakness was a death sentence. He had built his empire on ruthlessness, power, and fear, ensuring that no one could ever touch him, break him, or use him. He had no vulnerabilities. Until Clover. She had become his greatest weakness, and it terrified him. He told himself it was nothing, a passing distraction, something his mind would eventually discard, like a failed business deal or an unworthy opponent. But no matter how much he tried to erase her from his thoughts, no matter how much he told himself that she meant nothing, the truth remained. She had gotten under his skin, and Marco wasn't used to losing control. He saw her everywhere, not just in the city, not just in the reports his men brought him, but in his mind, his dreams, his waking thoughts. He remembered the way she had danced in the rain, free, uninhibited, untamed. He remembered the fire in her eyes when she defied him, the unwavering faith that made her stand against a man like him without fear. No one had ever dared to challenge him like that before. Clover didn't fear him. She didn't bow to him. She didn't need him. And that only made him want her more. But what disturbed him even more than the desire was something deeper, something foreign, the urge to protect her. He started watching over her, silently, invisibly. When she walked through the busy streets of Shanghai at night, he made sure there was always someone watching from the shadows. When she encountered threats, those who sought to intimidate her, silence her, make her disappear, he handled them before she even knew they existed. She would never know how many times he had saved her. He would never tell her, because this was not love. It couldn't be. Love was for the weak. And Marco wasn't weak. Marco's world was not safe. It was a world of shadows, of hidden threats, of men who would burn down entire cities for revenge. And Clover? She had walked into it unknowingly. She had no idea that her presence in his life, even from a distance, even as his enemy, had made her a target. Marco wasn't the only one watching her. There were others, men who wanted to hurt him, men who wanted to use her. They had seen how he looked at her. They had seen the way his gaze lingered too long. Marco Lee, the man who had no weaknesses, had finally revealed one, and the wolves had taken notice. One evening, he received the call. We know about the girl. A slow, cold rage burned in his chest. He didn't need to ask who they were talking about. He already knew. If you don't want her to get caught in the crossfire, stay out of our way. Marco barely breathed. He gripped his phone so tightly he nearly crushed it. His world was dark, dangerous, merciless, but no one would touch her. No one. He had built his empire on blood, and he had no problem spilling more of it. If they even so much as thought of touching her, he would burn everything down. Clover had tried to shut him out. She had tried to remind herself of who he was. A man with blood on his hands, a man who wielded power like a weapon, a man who did not belong in her God. And yet, she worried. Against all reason, against everything she believed, she worried about him. She prayed for him. At night, when she knelt in prayer, she found herself whispering his name. God, keep him safe. God, soften his heart. God, why do I care? It made no sense. She didn't want to care. She didn't want to feel anything for a man like Marco. But her heart betrayed her. She saw the way shadows moved around her, the way threats seemed to disappear before they could reach her. She didn't know how, but she knew Marco had something to do with it. He was protecting her. She should have been grateful. She should have been angry. She should have walked away completely. But instead, she stood at her window late into the night, staring out into the city, and whispered the prayer she never thought she would say. God, if there's still something in him worth saving, don't let him be lost. And in that moment, deep in her heart, she knew. No matter how much she fought it, no matter how much she tried to deny it, she was already falling for him. Marco Lee had never been denied anything. Power, wealth, influence. He commanded it all with a single word. In his world, money spoke louder than emotions, and power was more valuable than love. And yet, none of it worked on Clover. He tried everything, the grand gestures, the extravagant gifts, the luxury she had never known. He had seen women crumble at the sight of his wealth, eager to please, eager to belong in his world. But Clover was different. She didn't want his money. She didn't care for his power. When he sent a diamond necklace wrapped in the finest silk, she returned it without even opening the box. When he arranged a private dinner in the most exclusive restaurant in Shanghai, she declined, saying she had a commitment at the church that night. When he bought an entire humanitarian foundation in her name, thinking it would impress her, she simply said, "You can't buy a good heart, Marco." And for the first time in his life, Marco Lee questioned what love really meant. He wasn't used to this feeling of inadequacy. He could buy the world, but he couldn't buy her heart. He could command the most powerful men in the city, but he couldn't command her affection. What was he supposed to do with a woman like that? And yet, despite it all, he wanted her even more. She was a puzzle he couldn't solve, a battle he couldn't win, and Marco wasn't used to losing. Betrayal was nothing new to Marco. He had crushed men who had crossed him. He had built his empire by ensuring that loyalty was absolute and consequences were severe. But he had never expected the knife to come from his closest ally, someone he had trusted, someone he had built an empire with. The betrayal came swiftly, a silent strike in the shadows, and Clover was at the center of it. It started with whispers, then with threats. His enemies had noticed his growing obsession. They had seen the way his gaze lingered too long, the way he protected her without her knowing, and they had used it against him. Clover was taken. She was never meant to be part of this world, his world, a world of cold wars, of backroom deals, of men who saw human lives as nothing more than leverage. And now, she was leverage. His greatest enemy had made his move, but the betrayal was deeper than just a power play. It was an inside job. Someone from his own empire had given her up. The moment Marco found out, something inside him broke. The war he had fought in the business world, the blood he had spilled to build his empire, none of it had ever shaken him like this. This wasn't about revenge or profit or control. This was personal, and someone was going to pay. Marco was a man who never let his enemies win, and this time would be no different. He didn't care about laws, reputations, or collateral damage. He tore through Shanghai like a storm. The men who had touched Clover, who had dared to use her as leverage, they disappeared. He didn't just eliminate threats, he erased them. When he finally got Clover back, she was shaken but unharmed. And yet, something had changed. In her eyes, he saw fear, not of her captors, but of him. She had never looked at him that way before. That was the moment Marco realized he had won the war, but he had lost something far greater. Clover pulled away from him, retreating into the safety of the life she had built for herself. She saw what he had done, what he was capable of, and she wanted no part of it. "You saved me, but at what cost?" she asked him, voice filled with heartbreak. Marco had no answer. For the first time in his life, revenge felt empty, victory felt hollow, and Clover's absence felt like the greatest loss he had ever known. He had everything: power, wealth, control. And yet, without her, none of it mattered anymore. Marco had always been a man in control. He built his empire with an iron will, ruthless precision, and a heart as cold as steel. He had faced threats before, competitors, enemies, betrayers, and had eliminated them all without mercy. Clover had pulled away from him, declaring she wanted nothing to do with a man like him. Despite how much her heart ached because she deeply loved him, she refused to let herself fall. She was determined to reject his love, knowing Marco Lee was everything God's word warned her against. So she stayed away, trying desperately to forget him. But even though Clover had removed herself from Marco Lee's life, his enemies came for her again. Only this time, this was different. The attack was so brutal it left her hospitalized, fighting for her life. They had dared to touch the one person he would protect at all costs. Marco Lee's rage exploded with a force his men had never witnessed before. He unleashed hell. The men responsible never stood a chance. His vengeance was swift, merciless, and absolute. There was no negotiating, no warnings, no second chances. Marco hunted them down relentlessly, one by one. He didn't merely kill them, he erased them. Their businesses, their families, their allies. He reduced everything they'd ever built to ashes. By the time the last of them had fallen, Marco's hands were stained with even more blood. Yet this victory felt empty, the darkness deeper, and his heart more lost than ever before. But he didn't care, because Clover was alive. And anyone, whoever thought of hurting her again would meet the same fate. Clover could hardly believe what she was hearing. She had known Marco was dangerous, had seen glimpses of the merciless man behind the mask. But this was something else entirely. The man standing before her was not just ruthless, he was monstrous. And yet, when she looked into his eyes, all she saw was a man who would burn the world down for her. "Marco," she whispered, voice trembling, "what have you done?" Marco's jaw clenched. He had expected anger, but fear? That was new. "I handled it." His voice was devoid of emotion, as if what he had done was just another business transaction. "No," she said, shaking her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "You didn't just handle it. She swallowed hard, her voice breaking. "You slaughtered them." Marco stepped forward, towering over her. But for the first time, his presence made her want to run. He reached out for her, but she stepped back. His chest tightened. She had never pulled away from him in fear before. "You don't understand," he said, his voice dangerously low. "They hurt you. Anyone who touches you, I will personally send them out of this world." The words hit her like a knife to the chest. This wasn't just possessiveness or protection. This wasn't love. This was obsession, darkness, destruction. Clover's breath shuddered as she looked up at him, her heart breaking in ways she never thought possible. "How can I love a man like this?" she whispered. Marco stilled. She had never said it aloud before. Love. And yet, it wasn't spoken in joy or in confession. It was spoken in sorrow. Clover shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. This can't be God's doing." Marco's eyes darkened. "God?" A humorless, bitter chuckle escaped him. "Your God didn't protect you. I did." Clover's lips parted, her chest tight with disbelief. Marco took another step forward, but this time she turned away, and it shattered him. She left. Not just physically, she left him. The ache in Marco's chest was foreign, a wound deeper than any knife, deeper than any betrayal he had ever suffered. He had protected her. He had avenged her. He had done everything for her. And yet, she still doesn't want him. She still walked away. He stood there, staring at the empty space where she had been, feeling something he had never felt before. Loss, not power, not money, not control, but Clover. And for the first time in his life, it terrified him. His penthouse was silent, but his mind was a battlefield. The memories came like a flood. Blood, power, fear, loss. His grandmother's fragile hands, trembling as she tried to warm him on the streets. His enemies, pleading for their lives as he took everything from them. And now, Clover's eyes filled with heartbreak, looking at him like he was beyond saving. Marco stood in front of the mirror, his knuckles white as he gripped the edges of the sink. His reflection stared back at him, cold, hollow, monstrous. And then he saw him, his dying enemy, lying there, broken, bleeding, gasping for breath. The very thing Marco had created. And for the first time, he saw himself in that man. This is your future. The thought gripped him, strangled him. Clover had always said that there was something in him worth saving. But what if she was wrong? What if there was nothing left? He let out a harsh breath, his chest heaving, his heart racing. He pressed his hands to his face, feeling something unfamiliar trickle down his skin. Tears. Marco Lee did not cry, but tonight, he did. And as he sank to the cold floor, his back against the wall, he whispered the question he never thought he'd ask. God, am I too far gone? Marco didn't sleep often. Rest was for the weak. But that night, after Clover walked away from him, after she looked at him like he was beyond saving, something inside him cracked. The exhaustion seeped into his bones, dragging him into the kind of sleep he never allowed himself. But this was no ordinary sleep. This was a reckoning. He had a dream. He was no longer in his penthouse, no longer surrounded by the wealth and power that had become his armor. Instead, he was standing in the streets of his past, the cold, dark alleys where he had once starved and suffered, the place where he had lost everything. The air was thick with a bitter chill, the scent of rain-soaked pavement wrapping around him like a suffocating shroud. And then he saw him, an elderly man standing at the far end of the alley, dressed in white, his wrinkled face kind yet piercing with wisdom. Marco's breath hitched. There was something familiar about him, something eternal. The man gazed at him, sorrow in his eyes, as if he saw through every wall Marco had built, every sin he had committed. "This isn't who you were meant to be." The words hit like a hammer to his soul. Marco took a step back, his body stiff, his fist clenched. "Who are you?" His voice came out hoarse, defensive. The man didn't answer. Instead, he raised a frail hand and gestured around them. Suddenly, Marco saw himself. A young boy, thin and bruised, his eyes hollow with hunger, sitting on the cold pavement, shivering under a streetlight. Then he saw his grandmother, weak and frail, but still praying, even in the darkness, even when the world abandoned them. And then the image changed. He saw Clover, kneeling in prayer, tears falling from her eyes, whispering his name to a God he had denied. "God, I can't keep waiting for him to change." Marco's chest clenched, his fists opened, his breath shuddered. The old man stepped closer, his presence calming, yet heavy with truth. "This is the path you have chosen, but it is not the one you were made for." Marco wanted to deny it. He wanted to argue, to push back, to claim that there was nothing left in him to redeem. But the words stuck in his throat, because deep down, he knew it was true. Before Marco could speak, before he could ask what he was supposed to do, the man touched his shoulder and everything vanished. Marco woke up with a start. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body drenched in cold sweat. He sat up, gripping the sheets beneath him, his mind whirling with what he had seen. The boy in the alley, the prayers of his grandmother, Clover on her knees crying, and the voice, "This isn't who you were meant to be." For the first time in his life, Marco felt truly lost. Power, money, vengeance, none of it felt solid anymore. Because if that man was right, if he wasn't meant to be this monster, then who was he? And was it too late to find out? Across the city, Clover knelt in prayer, her heart breaking in ways she never thought possible. She had believed in miracles. She had believed in redemption, in change, in hope. She had believed in Marco. But how long could she wait for someone who refused to take God's hand? Her fingers curled into fists against the wooden floor. Her breaths were shaky, uneven as she stared at the cross before her, feeling the weight of her own doubts. "God, I can't keep waiting for him to change." The words felt like a betrayal, like a wound to her own faith. But wasn't it the truth? Hadn't she done everything she could? Hadn't she prayed? Hadn't she fought for his soul in the only way she knew how? But Marco refused to see it. He refused to change. Maybe he was too far gone. A tear slipped down her cheek. She hated this. She hated that she cared so deeply for a man who only knew destruction. And she hated that despite everything, despite the pain and the heartbreak. She still loved him. But what if she had gotten it wrong? What if she had mistaken her purpose? What if God wasn't asking her to stay, but to let go? Her breath hitched, her body trembling as she whispered the hardest words she had ever spoken. "God, tell me what to do. Do I walk away forever?" The silence stretched between her and heaven. No answer came, just like no answer came to Marco. They were both on the precipice, both standing at the edge of something greater than themselves. Clover had never prayed like this before. She had prayed for lost souls, for those in need, for the broken and the weary. But never had she fallen to her knees with this level of desperation, this depth of anguish, this raw and trembling ache in her soul. Her fingers gripped the edges of the wooden pew in the small church, her head bowed low, tears slipping freely down her face as she whispered over and over again, "God, please, reach him. break through the walls he has built around his heart. If there is anything left in him worth saving, God, don't let him be lost. But what if Marco didn't want to be saved? She had seen the blood on his hands, the way he wielded vengeance as if it were his divine right. She had watched him destroy men without a second thought, his power stretching like a shadow over the city. She had begged him to change. She had pleaded. She had waited. And now, she was running out of time. The world around her whispered that he was beyond saving, that there was no hope left for a man like Marco Lee. But Clover refused to believe that. Because if God's grace could reach the vilest sinner, if he could raise the dead and bring life from dust, then he could reach Marco. He had to. God, if you don't do something now, I fear I will lose him forever. The air around her felt heavy, charged with something unseen. She lifted her head, exhaling a shuddering breath. Something was coming. Something was about to break. Marco should have seen it coming. Betrayal was nothing new. He had spent his entire life watching for threats, crushing disloyalty before it could grow into something dangerous. But this one cut deeper than all the others, because it came from his right-hand man, the one person he trusted. The attack came swiftly without warning. A hostile takeover disguised as a final business deal, a strategic move meant to weaken him, to strip him of everything he had built. But they had underestimated him. Marco wasn't just a businessman. He wasn't just powerful. He was merciless. He was unstoppable. Until he learned that Clover was caught in the middle. That changed everything. The men coming for him weren't just after power anymore. They had discovered his greatest weakness, Clover. And now, she was in danger. The moment he realized this, the rage inside him burned hotter than it ever had before. I don't care what it takes. Find her, now! His men moved instantly, but Marco was already 3 steps ahead. He wouldn't let them take her. He wouldn't let them touch her. And he wouldn't hesitate to make them suffer for even trying. This wasn't just business. This was war. It all led to this moment. The rain fell in heavy sheets, turning the abandoned dockyard into a slick battlefield of shadows and steel. Marco stood in the center of it all, gun in hand, jaw clenched, body tensed. Across from him, his betrayer, his right-hand man, the man who had turned against him. And behind him, Clover, bound, frightened, staring at Marco with eyes that held both terror and hope. Hope, even now, even after everything. Marco barely heard the threat spilling from his former ally's lips. He barely noticed the armed men that stood behind him, waiting for their orders. Because in this moment, only one thing mattered. Clover. She was here. She was alive. And she was looking at him like she still believed in him. Marco, she said, her voice barely a whisper, but somehow it was louder than the rain, louder than the storm inside him. His hands trembled around the gun. The man before him had betrayed him, had used Clover, had tried to destroy everything Marco had built, and he deserved to die for it. Every instinct in Marco's body screamed for vengeance. Every piece of his past, every painful lesson, every ruthless choice had led to this. This was who he was. He was Marco Lee, the man who never hesitated, the man who always struck first. He raised the gun, and then he saw himself, not as he was now, not as the untouchable CEO, the feared leader, the man who had built an empire of power. He saw himself as a boy, cold, hungry, angry, and he realized this was the moment that would decide who he truly was, the moment that would determine if he was too far gone. Marco, Clover's voice shook, but it wasn't fear that filled it this time. It was faith in him. He had spent his whole life believing that God had abandoned him, that he had to survive on his own. But maybe Clover had been right. Maybe God hadn't abandoned him. Maybe God had sent her. Marco exhaled, and for the first time in his entire life, he hesitated. Then he remembered, this isn't who you were meant to be. The gun in his hand felt heavier than it ever had before. Killing this man wouldn't change the past. It wouldn't fix what was broken. It wouldn't make Clover look at him the way he wanted her to. It wouldn't save him. The rain pounded against his skin as he made his choice. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered the gun. He let out a long breath and then tossed it to the ground. His betrayer flinched, as if he had expected a bullet instead of mercy. And Marco turned away, toward Clover, toward something new, toward redemption. And just like that, Marco Lee walked away from the life he had always known, and into the unknown, into faith. The rain came down in torrents, washing away the blood that had been spilled, drenching the city in a cleansing storm that felt almost divine. Marco Lee, the man who had ruled with an iron hand, who had never bowed to anyone or anything, was now on his knees. Not in defeat, not in despair, but in surrender. His hands, once so steady, so ruthless, so sure, now trembled. His breath came ragged, uneven, broken. He felt the weight of every sin, every crime, every moment of his life where he had chosen power over humanity, vengeance over mercy, destruction over salvation. And for the first time, it crushed him. His fingers curled into the mud beneath him, his head bowed low, the rain mingling with the tears he hadn't realized were falling. His voice came out hoarse, raw, shattered as he whispered to the God he had denied his entire life, God, I don't know how to do this. The words felt foreign on his lips, as if they didn't belong to him. But if you can hear me, if you will have me, I surrender. The storm raged around him, but inside, something shifted. Something broke. Something he had spent his entire life holding on to finally let go. And as the rain poured down on him, Marco felt lighter. For the first time in his life, he wasn't carrying it alone. A sudden gust of wind sent a chill down his spine, but Marco barely noticed. Slowly, he reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around a small, blood-stained object. It was a symbol of everything he had been, a token of his past, his power, his darkness. He held it in his palm, staring at it through the downpour. This was who he had been. This was the man he had built himself into. But it was not who he wanted to be anymore. Not for Clover, not for himself, not for the God who had given him a second chance. Marco's fingers tightened around it one last time, and then, with a breath that felt like freedom, he threw it away. The object spun through the air, disappearing into the storm, swallowed by the rain-soaked earth. It was done. He had let go. And for the first time, he didn't feel lost. Clover stood frozen, watching the man who had once embodied everything she feared, everything she prayed against, kneeling before God. The sight stole her breath. She had dreamed of Marco's redemption. She had prayed for it. But she never thought she would actually see it. Her lips parted, her heart hammering in her chest. She wanted to move, wanted to speak, but she couldn't. All she could do was watch as Marco Lee, the untouchable, unshakable man, fell to his knees before the God he had spent his whole life running from. Tears burned in her eyes, mixing with the rain. This wasn't just a moment. This was a miracle. For Marco Lee, it would have been so easy to go back, to return to the empire he had built, to reclaim the power he had wielded for so long. But he knew the truth now. Power had never been real. Control had always been an illusion. And revenge had never satisfied the hunger inside him. Clover had shown him a different path, but he had to choose it himself. Because this great God of second chances will never force you to accept him, nor will he compel you to choose his path. Instead, he gently guides you toward the light, patiently waiting with open arms full of love, ready to welcome you home whenever you're ready to return. He looked up from the mud, his eyes locking onto hers. She was watching him, her expression unreadable, but her eyes were full of something he had never seen directed at him before. Not fear, not anger, not heartbreak, hope. And he couldn't let that die. Not again, not after everything. Slowly, he rose to his feet. He was soaked to the bone, cold, trembling. But for the first time, he was at peace. He stepped toward her, her breath hitched. "Marco," she whispered, unsure, afraid to believe this was real. He held her gaze, his voice stronger than it had ever been. "I'm done, Clover." She frowned, searching his face. "Done?" He nodded. Sure, steady, unwavering. With all of it, the power, the vengeance, the life I built on blood and fear. He exhaled a breath that felt like freedom. "I choose God. I choose you." Tears spilled from Clover's eyes. She had prayed for this moment, not knowing if it would actually come. She had never expected Marco Lee to choose God over power, but she had kept the faith anyway. And now, here he was. Here they were, in the rain, washed clean, saved, a new man, together. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old has gone, the new is here. 2 Corinthians 5:17. Marco Lee had once been a man who ruled with fear, who believed in nothing but power, vengeance, and survival. That man was gone. But transformation was not immediate, nor was it easy. Letting go of an empire built on control and blood meant stepping into the unknown, something that terrified him more than any enemy ever had. He had once believed strength meant never bowing to anyone. Now, he was learning that true strength was surrendering to something greater than himself. There were days of doubt, of struggle, of questioning. There were nights where he stared at the sky, wondering if God had really accepted him. There were moments he almost turned back, thinking it was easier to be feared than to be redeemed. But each time he would hear Clover's voice, soft and unwavering. God's love is patient. It never gives up on us. And little by little, his heart began to change. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Psalm 37:4. Clover had never expected him to change. She had hoped, prayed, and believed, but expectation was different from faith. She had prepared herself for the reality that Marco might never find his way to God. But here he was, not perfect, not healed overnight, but trying. The man who had once denied God's existence now opened a Bible with trembling hands. The man who had once believed in vengeance now asked for forgiveness. The man who had once thought love was a weakness now held her hand with reverence, not possession. It was not his love for her that had changed him. It was his love for God. And that was the greatest gift of all. "I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh." Ezekiel 36:26. Marco had once owned the world, but it had left him empty. Now he had nothing. No empire, no power, no name that sent people trembling in fear. And yet, for the first time, he had peace. It was a strange kind of freedom, one he had never known before. He wasn't the ruthless CEO anymore. He wasn't the man who crushed lives with a flick of his wrist. He was simply Marco, a man who was learning to walk in faith. And Clover, the woman who had first made him believe, walked beside him, not as his possession, but as his partner in Christ. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. 1 Corinthians 13, 4-5. One day, as they stood at the edge of the ocean, the golden sun dipped below the horizon. Marco inhaled deeply, feeling the salt in the air, the quiet stillness of a life no longer dictated by power or revenge. Clover stood beside him, her presence a gentle, unwavering light. She'd given him no ultimatums, no conditions, no demands. She had simply loved him the way Christ loves, without force, without fear, without expectation. And that had changed everything. Marco turned to her, taking her hands in his. Not as a man who wanted to own her, not as a man who needed to prove himself worthy of her, but as a man who had been saved. "I don't deserve you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Clover smiled softly. "Neither of us deserve God's grace, but he gives it anyway." A breath shuddered from his lips. He reached up, cupping her face with the same hands that had once destroyed, but now only wanted to protect. There was no desperation in his touch, no hunger for control, only love, pure, steady, unshakable. As the waves rolled onto the shore, they held onto each other, not in passion, but in faith. And for the first time, Marco Lee finally understood what it meant to be truly free. He was exactly where he was always meant to be, beside the one person destined for him, Clover, the love of his life. And step by step, he was becoming the man God had intended him to be, walking in faith with God gently holding his hand and guiding every step of the journey. A love redeemed, a soul restored, a future reborn. And this was only the beginning. The end.